So on behalf of the Bahá'í Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya University, I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished panelists and participants to this webinar on development with participation towards a more just and prosperous rural economy. This is the second in the series of webinars being organized by the Bahá'í Chair on the social and economic impact of the COVID pandemic on vulnerable and marginalized populations in India's rural and urban areas. These webinars seek to explore a path towards a more inclusive and just process of development for rural and urban areas. Moving ahead on such a path, it is acknowledged, would require not just structural and systemic changes, but also the will to recognize and overcome certain biases and blind spots in development thought. With regard to those in conditions of poverty whose realities and capacities are not sufficiently acknowledged or drawn upon. The more than 30 million migrants who returned from cities to rural areas in the wake of the COVID pandemic brought into sharp focus the crisis facing rural India. For many, the immediate question was how would these millions of workers be provided employment in rural areas? Why did so many feel compelled to leave their villages and migrate to cities in search of livelihoods? The crisis then has raised the more fundamental question of the vision our society and policymakers have for the future of India's villages. For a resource-rich country such as India with its civilizational roots in villages, did the path to development for rural peoples necessitate the migration of such large numbers to cities? Once the intensity of the present crisis subsides, is the only option before policymakers to re-implement the same policies that created the conditions that caused such massive rural to urban migration? Or is it possible to conceive of an alternative path to development that draws from the rich set of resources that the rural inhabitants themselves have to offer? The standard prescription for reducing distress migration from rural to urban areas is for the rural economy to achieve high levels of growth, which will provide greater employment opportunities and raise the income of rural households. For this to happen, economists suggest that among other things, there needs to be sectoral diversification of the rural economy and the promotion of non-agricultural economic activities in rural areas. Yet for economic development to genuinely contribute to enhanced well-being at the individual and collective level, technical prescriptions will need to be located within the broader vision of social and economic justice. While economic growth is vital, experience has shown that if policies that promote it are not guided by the principle of justice, they can replicate entrenched patterns of exploitation and dependency that lead to the fruits of rural prosperity being once again commandeered by a new or existing elite. Similarly, as rural economies modernize, considerations of justice would demand that the rural people have a say in the kind of society that is being built. A conscious citizenry would be vigilant that the process of modernization does not bring to the rural area some of the excesses of unplanned urbanization, such as the pollution of the environment, the erosion of cultural heritage, the breakdown of social bonds, the sense of anomie, and economic disparities. Policymakers have indicated that in addition to social protection, rural people need training and capacity building to provide human resources for an increasingly diversified economy. However, with the acquisition of scientific knowledge and technical skills and know-how, while they are no doubt necessary, the existing knowledge base in rural communities and the social, cultural, and spiritual values of the people can be valuable contributions to the development process that must not be ignored. In fact, one of the strengths of rural communities is their diversity. Each community has a rich agroecological context, knowledge base, history, tradition, and value system that can generate diverse bases for social progress. Some of the most innovative and socially progressive development programs in India over the past few decades have been those that have recognized the knowledge, values, and capacities of rural people and creatively drawn upon them in the development process. This webinar seeks to open a conceptual space for exploring insights that show a way forward towards a more just and inclusive form of rural development, where economic growth is in sync with the goals of strengthening the social fabric, preserving the environment, and upholding spiritual convictions. Friends, before we go on, just a few details about for the participants. We will take questions for the speakers. Participants are requested to type their questions in the Q&A box, and the speakers will have are requested to confine their initial comments to 15 minutes. And in case there is you do end up going a little beyond that, then I will remind you by sending you a small message. Our first speaker for today's webinar is Professor Ravi Srivastava, who is Professor and Director, Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, and Chairman of the Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur. He is a former Professor of Economics and Chairperson, Center for the Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and a full-time member of the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. Professor Srivastava's main areas of research and publication include labor and employment, migration, social protection, agriculture, rural development and rural poverty, the informal sector, regional development, decentralization, human development, and land reforms. He has published numerous books and monographs and more than 100 papers in national and international journals. Professor Srivastava is a recipient of numerous awards and scholarships, including the University Grants Commission's Award in Economics for innovative research on poverty, combining qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and more recently, the V.V. Giri Memorial Award for contribution to research on labor migration. Without taking more time, I would like to invite Professor Srivastava to address the participants.
Thank you, Dr. Fazli, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. Actually, your introductory remarks have laid the groundwork for the webinar, but I'll just say a few more things in relation to the current motivation for something like this, for this webinar. As you pointed out, after this pandemic and the lockdown that followed it, we saw, and in my own estimates, we saw a return of something like 4 to 5 crore, 40 to 50 million migrants returning interstate, mainly to 8 source states in the country. But actually, if we include intrastate migrants, those who returned within states, and these were also a large number, the numbers would probably be closer to 80 million migrants. So I think, and we saw the conditions under which these migrants returned. These helped us to focus on the conditions under which they lived and worked in urban areas, the precarity of their working conditions. Secondly, the discrimination that they faced at the hands of the state and also in some cases the community. And then when they returned to the villages, we saw the cracks in rural society, because this discrimination did not only happen on the way or in destinations, but was also practiced against them in their very villages, in the source villages from when they came. Then, of course, there were questions on how they would be absorbed. And then this led to a questioning of why they left the villages in the first place. Lack of livelihoods, lack of employment. But it opened up spaces because policy had to willy-nilly begin to focus on rural regeneration and rural jobs to whatever success. And we had a whole spate of policies, both by the central governments and by several state governments, varying in intensity, varying in scope across states, which were aimed at absorbing the rural migrants in the local economies and which were linked to the task of rural regeneration, agricultural regeneration, small-scale industry, and so on and so forth. So this basically opens up also for the kind of issues, the space for us to discuss the kind of issues that you raise in this webinar. The question of participation, justice, and rural development. So thank you for opening up this whole, this band of issues. What I will do in the first few minutes is actually to lay down the conceptual and empirical background in which I would like to pose some of these issues with respect to rural development. And then perhaps just in the last 5 minutes or so, make a broad distinction towards the kind of steps that we are needed for participatory development in rural areas. To begin with, this whole question of what is, we need to question and critique what is rural and what is urban, because when we talk about rural, we somehow take it for granted that everybody has a common understanding or has an understanding of what rural is. Even within the Indian, let's say the official setup, there are very two distinct connotations. One is the administrative connotation of what rural is, and this has to do with how areas are being administered, whether there are a notified area, whether they're being administered by a municipal corporation, whether they're being administered through the three-tier Panchayati Raj structure and so on. But then as divorced from that, as different from that, there is a census definition of towns. And in the last census, the census notified 4,000 new urban areas. And this is a part of that long-standing debate on how urbanized is India. So for example, some of my colleagues, Professor Amitabh Kundu, and you heard him, I think you had him in the last webinar, talks about census activism, because the census towns are notified on the basis of census projections, and he has questioned some of this. On the other hand, my senior colleague, Professor Yoginder Alag, has been writing since the past 3 decades on how he believes that urbanization in India is not properly measured, is underestimated. So, and within these two concepts, there are sociologists, and I would particularly like to mention somebody like Professor Deepankar Gupta, who has been talking about the urbanization of a rural population. So he says the rural populations, because of the interactions with the urban areas, multiple kinds of interactions, have been increasingly acquiring urban characteristics. So basically, broadly speaking, in different spatial ways, the characteristics between the rural and the urban are definitely getting blurred. And this is something we need to recognize. Secondly, there are broad spatialities. When we look at rurality and urbanness, there are spatial considerations. For example, even if we go by the way we measure urbanization just now, Gujarat is almost 50% urbanized. Kerala although there is a rural-urban, distinction in states like Kerala and Punjab, but the fact is that the distinction between rural, in Kerala context, we talk about a continuity, the rural-urban continuity. And in areas in states like Punjab and so on, where the rural infrastructure is very well developed, the distinction between rural and urban is increasingly getting less important because of the development of social and physical infrastructure. And this is something we also have to keep in mind when we talk about rurality and rural areas. Though broadly speaking, we do stick to this administrative notion of the rural, and it is within that we define the characteristics of the rural. So I think the broad features of the rural, which are ingrained in the mind through these administrative categorizations, are something which are very well understood. So roughly about 70% of the population, 60, 68, 69% of the population in 2011 was considered to be rural. Roughly about 72% of the workforce was considered to be rural. They together now contribute, again, in terms of sectors of origin, roughly about 45% of the gross value added in the country. Out of this, roughly 40%, approximately 40% is a contribution of agriculture. And within agriculture, the crop agriculture, sometimes we think of agriculture only as being crop agriculture, but agriculture is much more than crop agriculture. It is crop agriculture, livestock, forestry, fishery, and all that. So crop agriculture constitutes around 45%. So we need to understand the broad rural landscape, and if the general, the general boundary is that if 70% of the population is contributing roughly about 45% of the gross domestic product, then clearly there is a large differential in rural-urban worker productivity. It's roughly about 2.8 times. So every urban worker on average produces 2.8 times what a rural worker produces. And an urban worker produces roughly about 4.6 times what a farm worker produces in rural areas. So this manifests itself in levels of differences in levels of living, disparities between rural and urban areas, which by the way have in general been growing over a period of time. And this is something I'll devote a little bit of more attention to in the next few minutes. But the second thing I want to draw your attention to is the rural areas are not homogeneous. We've just now spoken about the spatial aspects of rurality. Punjab, Kerala, Bihar have very distinct characteristics. Beyond that, actually the rural areas are characterized by distinct class and caste-based differences and differentiations, and local structures of dominance. These are partly based on landholding structures, but now increasingly both agricultural and non-agricultural sources of income and wealth contribute to this differentiation. Because a large part of rural incomes now originate in non-agricultural incomes, and they also originate from outside the rural areas. And this is now reinforcing the kind of structures of dominance and differentiation that you have in rural areas. So structures of patriarchy, structures of caste and class differentiation are extremely important if you try to understand the rural areas. If you basically base yourself only on land, that we know that 86% of holdings in India are marginal and small holdings, but they control only about 45% of the land. So the remaining 55% of the land is still with medium and large holdings. And this, of course, varies across this thing. The other, I think, the very important point I think we need to understand is the rural areas. We can talk about rurality, rural development, but the rural areas are not autonomous. The rural and urban economies are very closely enmeshed and interlinked, but with differences. I come from a background of development economics, where standardly we speak in the same breath of urbanization and industrialization. And the processes of urbanization and industrialization are fed by what we call economies of scale and externalities. Urbanization has a long history. Urbanization goes back into prehistory. And we have urban areas from prehistory because of the ease of transaction between dense populations, provision of services, ease of transactions, and so on and so forth. But this has with the coming of capitalism, the features which make for agglomeration of population and agglomeration of economies have increased with scale economies. And this has contributed to large urban agglomerations, large centers of economic growth. This has contributed to new patterns of unequal development under capitalism. But there is on the one hand, there is a constant interlinkage between rural and urban areas, which is characterized by a flow of resources, two-way flow of resources, not only a one-way flow of resources, it's a two-way flow of resources. Both labor and non-labor, or different kinds of resources flow one another. But on the other hand, it's just not simply a technical and a market exchange. This market exchange is actually embedded in both state and market processes. It is embedded in the nature of capitalism and the nature of the state in India. In fact, you go back a long way. If you look, for example, at the British Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism in Britain, which is we call industrial capitalism in Britain as the oldest capitalism, it had a lot to do with the enclosure movement in Britain, which in some sense, which accelerated the development of capitalism in agriculture. So the rural areas have long been seen as a source of surplus generation for urban accumulation and for capitalist accumulation, industrial accumulation, and what Marxists call primitive capital accumulation, primitive capitalist accumulation. And if you look at also socialist development, if you look at development in China and Russia in post 1918, China post 1949, both China and Russia theorized on what they call socialist primitive accumulation. Basically, drawing on rural and agricultural resources to build the industrial base in the country. So in other words, there is this is not just a benign development, a development which is characterized by flow of resources between rural areas and urban areas, low productivity and high productive areas, but it's also an area, and it's not only it's something which is characterized by market power and so on. It is something which is aided and abetted by the state. The process of capitalist accumulation, which is at the center of all this, is aided and abetted by the state. And if you look at the Indian features of rural development, you constantly see over the last 30 to 40 years, you see declining support to rural areas. You see declining support to agricultural areas. You see that the rural markets and agricultural markets are increasingly being priced open for global capital as well as for national capital. So this process of unequal exchange, and you see this whole process in its most, I would say, maybe violent form is too strong a word, but its most aggressive form when you look at tribal areas and forested areas in this country, which are also the most resource rich. So if you look very closely at the processes of development, particularly since liberalization, and you see how aggressively this has, in a sense, exploited natural mineral resources and also labor resources in these areas in the country, you realize that it's the whole paradigm in which we are trying to look at rural development is built on supporting a form of capitalism and a form of global capitalism, and that what the state then tends to put back in terms of resources in rural development actually is, in a sense, much less than what it snatches away. And this is despite the fact that the rural areas are the heart and lung of development. They provide the environmental resources, they provide the natural resources, they provide the agricultural resources to India's development. So this is the context in which we need to speak about rural development. We cannot think of just village republics. The rural development is not autonomous development. So then how do we take this process forward in a form which is just? One more thing before I come to that, that is also the whole question of governance structure, which is very much part and parcel of how we view development. So we moved gradually the governmental structure, which is the central government. We had a federal government or a quasi-federal government in the center and the states. But in 92, 93, we also then had a third tier of government, the local governments, and they were empowered by the constitution. But what we have seen since this third tier of government has taken place, we have seen that capacity has not been adequately built up in the local government structure to take over. The functions have not been devolved, finances have not been devolved, responsibility has not been adequately devolved to local government structures. Their capture by the dominant elite, despite the fact that there has been a system of reservations, 1/3 reservation for women, reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, in many states reservation for OBCs, but the capture of these rural institutions by the dominant elite and the patriarchal elite has continued nonetheless. Many of you would have noticed, many of my participants would have noticed that 25 years passed us by of this process since 92, since we had this major constitutional amendment. And you would not have even noticed editorial in papers. Forget about the fact that, this was not something which was celebrated. We did not review how India has been done after 25 years of this whole process of devolution. So devolution almost has died a silent death. This very important process of putting into place a third tier of government has actually literally died a silent death. So what is the scope and how do we think of the kind of issues that this seminar talks about? I would highlight a few issues. So one is, I think we need to understand that rural development is just not something we can talk about in the abstract. Rural development, or the lack of it, the pattern that we are seeing of rural-urban interactions is embedded in a neoliberal state policy, is embedded in a framework of global capitalism. And this is something we see constantly when we review policies. If we want rural development, then we need to re-engineer policies. And we need to re-engineer policies beginning with, basically, we need to reconfigure macro policies. And we need to seek a reworking of the neoliberal state, which in the name of withdrawing from developmental functions, actually takes on more and more functions. So we never get a small state. We always get a larger and larger government to deal with. But this only happens in areas which is in line with neoliberal thinking. And this is a paradox which we need to understand. And disentangling any paradigm of development which challenges neoliberal orthodoxy is not easy. But this is where we will need to seek, if you want to seek participation and rural regeneration, and if you want to think of rural development in an alternative paradigm, that is where we will have to begin. So we will have to address major asymmetries which are both state and market induced. Having said this, I must point out that there is a little more space at the moment to advocate these policies, given the current urgency and given the the central government emphasis on what it calls self-reliance, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and also being vocal about local. Now, both these concepts are actually imbued with ambiguity. We talk about self-reliance, but we are prying the economy open, in the rural economy open, for multinationals and global capital. So what kind of self-reliance are we talking about? What kind of vocal and local are we talking about if large-scale retail, contract farming is being encouraged and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, these are two broad slogans on which we can try to pry open the policy space. And we have to do it in three broad areas. And I'll just, very briefly touch on them. Maybe in the question answer session, we can talk a little bit more about them. The first is, I've already, talked a little about it, is to talk about principles of basically governance, local governance, which has to be based on very sound principles of what we economists call the assignment principle. In other words, let the local level or the lower level of government should be able to do, should have the responsibility of doing whatever it is domain. So its finances, its resource base, its functions, its responsibility should tally with what its capacity, what it is able to do in local domain. And it must be higher levels of government have a very important role. But this must be consistent with the assignment principle, which we talk about in a federal setup. And this is also within the context of the three levels of government. But this, of course, means that local government must be in tune with democratic and participative principles. Within India, we have the example, for example, of Kerala, where it has sought to build local government on the foundations of local participation by the rural poor. Every state cannot be Kerala, because Kerala, what is Kerala today is built on a very strong social and political movement of the past. But if we imbibe those principles, we can gradually work towards those objectives. Okay, so that is the first thing. Secondly, we need to strengthen the local economy and local capacity. And this has major implications for ecological and environmental development. The more local the economy becomes, the stronger is local capacity, the more it is possible to build an economy on environmental principles. Now, the one point that I want to make is that it is more today, the scale economies of the conventional kind have become much weaker than they used to be. It is much more possible today to build a decentralized economy. But that decentralized economy needs to be supported. Institutional capacity needs to be built. Organizational capacity needs to be built. And the biggest element of support today, as we know, the major centralizing within the economy, it is information which is becoming the major centralizing principle. So you see the large corporations of today are basically being built on information asymmetries. And it is the role of the government to correct it and to build information hubs on which local producers, farmers, non-farmers can come together and build local economies. So this whole concept of a 100-mile economy, for example, which Seva is now advocating, is something which we need to look very closely at, which has to be built on modern principles of information networks. Okay? But it has to be fostered by higher levels of government and support. The third issue is something which you would have covered in the last webinar, and I just want to flag it, which is when we talk about rural is not only rural. So we need to talk about rural within the context of an integrated rural-urban and regional planning framework. And when we talk about an integrated rural and a rural-urban framework, on the one hand, we are talking about strengthening rural social and physical infrastructure at one end. On the other end, we are talking about inclusive urbanization. And all this being done within a framework of integrated regional planning and rural-urban planning. Essentially, these three elements are what we would like, I would like our participant and us to think about. How do we do this? Unpackage them as much as possible. I think an alternative paradigm is not going to be built purely on a village republic, on an autonomous. It has to be built on an alternative vision for where the economy needs to go, and that needs to proceed from bottom upwards on principles of governance, on principles of economy, which are today far more feasible because we live in a post-Fordist world where scale economies do not matter the way they used to, than it was possible 15 or 20 years ago. So let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Srivastava, for really setting up the discussion and providing both a conceptual clarification of in a sense, a reading of the state of rural and urban India. And you brought up many issues about how the distinction between the rural and urban is being blurred on the one hand. On the other hand, there is one has to recognize the patterns of dominance that are being continue to exist within rural settings, distinction and dominance. And then you left us with these three, in a sense, if one has to grapple with the macroeconomic framework, and it's not possible to do that without engaging with the neoliberal agenda and the hold that it has over policy making. And so in order to be able to engage with that in a meaningful way, in an effective way, you identified three areas where our thinking and our exploration of these questions can be more nuanced and in a sense engage with the reality that exists. The first was the need for strengthening local governance and the structures that exist, but that somehow these have not been able to draw upon the capacities of people and to work in a way that would actually stimulate participation. The second one was the question of strengthening local economies, where you actually pointed out how, in a sense, there is an opportunity with the present crisis and the move towards more self-reliance. Although that has its own ambiguities, which you mentioned. However, there is this opportunity and the need to strengthen local economies. And you also pointed out how local economies are increasingly being built around information hubs, which I hope we can engage more with this idea, because somehow tied with the idea of meaningful participation is the question of how much the flow of knowledge, in the sense, how can people engaged in the process of development be participants. Information is at the most essential at the basic level, but also to be able to contribute to the knowledge that is used and drawn upon in the process of development that they are engaged. And the third issue was we need to look at integrated regional planning and development and recognize the fact that we are not talking about these autonomous village republics, but that they're actually one has to recognize the very complex relationships and reciprocity that exists, although it is to the detriment of rural India, as you mentioned, with the capitalist model of development. However, it is in this, it is in recognizing this that one can begin to make policy, interventions that are meaningful and that actually can bring a change. So friends, we can move on to the next speaker on our panel. Um, Dr. Devinder Sharma is a distinguished food and trade policy analyst. He is trained as an agricultural scientist and has been an award-winning journalist. He quit active journalism to research on policy issues concerning sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, and intellectual property rights, environment and development, food security and poverty, and biotechnology and hunger. Dr. Sharma has been awarded with the honorary degree of Professor at Large by the CSK Himachal Pradesh Agricultural University. He's also a visiting professor at the Sardar Patel University of Police Security and Criminal Justice, and has formerly been a visiting fellow at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, visiting fellow at the School of Development Studies at the University of East Anglia, and a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. Just before I invite Dr. Sharma to begin his address, I wanted to also remind participants to share their questions on the Q&A box. Dr. Sharma.
Thank you, Dr. Fazli, and thank you to the Bahá'í Chair for inviting me to this topic, which has been something that a few of us has been struggling for the last 30 or 40 years to bring back some sanity in economic thinking. And I think this subject today takes us a step forward in that direction. When we talk of the way we have ignored rural economy all these decades, I think an illustration to that I would like to present here is an incident in which I was a participant. I remember it was way back in 1996 that I was at a conference at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai. And I recall the then Vice President Sustainable Development of the World Bank, a friend of mine called Dr. Ismail Saragalden. In his presentation, he said that in the next 20 years, which means by the year 2015, the World Bank estimates that the number of people who will be migrating from the rural to the urban areas in India will be equal to twice the combined population of UK, France, and Germany. The combined population of UK, France, and Germany in 1990s or 1995 or 1996 was 200 million. And the World Bank estimate was that 400 million people will be migrating from the rural to the urban areas in India in the next 20 years, which would be by 2015. Now, for a number of years, as a journalist at that time, I believed that the World Bank was trying to alert us, to warn us, or to tell us that you must make a course correction. But then I later realized, no, it wasn't a warning to us, it was a directive to us. And when I look at the successive World Development Reports, annual World Development Reports, I recall in 2008, the report said something, in as many words that you were given a task, you haven't done it, so now hasten the process. So how do you hasten the process? You go in for land rentals, land acquisitions, land markets, and move these people out of agriculture, because land is a productive asset, and it is in the hands of inefficient producer, quote unquote. They were the farmers. So move these people out into the urban areas to become part of the industrial force. And also they said that the younger people in agriculture, in farming, do not know anything besides farming. So to make them a part of the industrial workforce or to train them, you need to set up a network of training institutes across the country so that you can absorb this population. I was surprised the next year the government announced setting up of made provision for setting up of 1,000 industrial training institutes. So the World Bank told us in 2008, and we did it in 2009. Now these successive governments over the decades have actually followed that World Bank prescription, and of course it comes with the neoliberal economics thinking, and also the capitalistic mode that Professor Srivastava talked about it. In the last 4 decades, at least that I have seen, I have understood that we have a wonderful policy of socialism for the corporates and capitalism for the farmers. And this is, I think, what we need to understand, especially the development practitioners need to understand how this has been deliberately imbibed in a manner that even the vocabulary has changed very comfortably, suitably, so that, you know, we are trained or we are made to believe as if the development is only possible, unless development is only possible, you know, through the corporate mechanism or through the corporate route, and rest of all is a burden on the society. This is what we have been actually pushing for, or we have been made to believe in the last 4 decades that I have seen. Now, it is very sad and surprising that in a country which has been spelled out earlier by you, that we have about roughly 50% of the population involved with agriculture, and 70% of the rural households are of course related to or dependent on agriculture. Now, in this particular situation, when we saw these reverse migration, the massive reverse migration, I was reminded of when I wrote an article some decades back after the World Bank prescription to us, that these people, 400 million people who the World Bank thinks who World Bank is telling us to move out of the rural areas, actually are agricultural refugees. These are agricultural refugees because we have created those conditions, uneconomical conditions, as a result of which they have no choice but to quit and move on into the urban areas looking for menial jobs. These agriculture refugees, I can understand the nation didn't perhaps understand when I said that these are agriculture refugees, because there was no visual in front of them. But now the reverse migration, the extent migration, and what I'm glad you talked about 30 million, and Professor Srivastava has said if we look add on intra-state also, it comes to about 80 million. I think it tells us the extent of agriculture refugees that existed in this country. And I think it tells us very clearly that we need to go back and learn and to find out why, in the first instance, you know, the conditions were so that these people moved out of rural areas. Was something wrong with agriculture production, or was it a deliberate attempt? In my understanding, and I've been saying, we have deliberately kept agriculture impoverished all these years because we could facilitate the process of moving these people out into the urban areas, because urban areas needed cheaper labor. Because in fact, economic reforms are viable only if agriculture is sacrificed. That is a process that the West followed first, and then it is now being imposed on the developing countries. We in India have a wonderful team of, I would say, array of or army of mainline economists who have blindly followed the World Bank prescription and have doled out that as the model of growth for India. So I was very happy when the Prime Minister first talked about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and then he talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat. But perhaps the dominant economic thinking here is very uncomfortable with Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I remember when the Prime Minister first talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat, the number of articles in the newspapers, including editorials, said this is not the right way for India. But when in the next address to the nation, Prime Minister again talked about Atmanirbhar Bharat, then I think they got the message. And now they're saying, no, the Atmanirbhar Bharat he talks about is not self-reliant. Actually, he's talking about being part of the global value chain and so on and so forth. So we have now justification coming up for that kind of Atmanirbhar, that they want us to actually not to deviate from the kind of thinking that Prime Minister is perhaps trying to bring in. So the point I'm trying to make is that over the last few decades, we have deliberately kept agriculture impoverished to keep the economic reforms viable. Economic reforms actually are dependent upon agriculture which is not doing well. Why? Because one, you need to keep the inflation low. If the food prices are low, the inflation would be low, and of course that is what economic reforms is all about. You know, the so-called competitive base is only limited to agriculture. Second thing is when we come to the labor force, as I said earlier, you know, Manmohan Singh used to say that we have 80% more labor in agriculture and we need to move them out of agriculture into the urban areas. I remember Chidambaram saying we have 70% more workforce in agriculture. And recently, Raghuram Rajan in an interview had gone on to say that the biggest reforms would be when we are able to move farmers, make them abandon agriculture, move them into urban areas, because urban areas need cheaper labor. This is what economic reforms is all about. And if Dihadi Mazdoor, cheaper labor means Dihadi Mazdoor. If Dihadi Mazdoor is all that we call as employment generation, I think the entire economic design has to be relooked at. And perhaps here is a glorious opportunity before us now. Pandemic has brought that before us very clearly and starkly that, the kind of reverse migration that the country has seen, it clearly shows that that was not the way forward. That was not the way of development that the world actually looked for, or what the capital economists or capital economy had actually convinced us that's the way forward. So I think this is a challenge before us now. But before we go into what is the way forward, I think let's look into how this was made possible. The best way to push people out of agriculture into the urban areas, because land, as I said, is a productive asset, and the eyes were all on that land. So it became easy to do so by keeping farmers, as I said, deliberately impoverished. Now, when I say deliberately impoverished, let me also clear as to what extent of impoverishment prevailed over the last few decades. I remember in 1970, when the Green Revolution were in the formative years in India, the wheat price, the minimum support price for wheat was 76 rupees per quintal. Now, 45 years later, when we looked into it again, it was in 2015. In 2015, the wheat price rose to 1,450 rupees per quintal, 1,450 per quintal. This was an increase of 19 times. Now, to compare, to look into how agriculture fared with other sections of society, I just took the basic pay and DA of the government employees. And I looked into the 45 years, the basic pay and DA, and I'm not talking about the other emoluments. The basic pay and DA of government employees was increased by 120 to 150 times. The basic pay and DA of the university and college professors had increased by 150 to 170 times. The basic pay and DA of the school teachers had increased by 280 to 320 times. And the income of farmers had increased by 19 times. I'm sure you will all agree, if the income of the other section of the society had increased in the same proportion as the farmers, many would have quit those jobs or perhaps gone for suicide, as the agriculture sector is witnessing. Now, this is what has happened, what has transpired in these last 4 decades, at least, that I have worked on or I have been following. Comes a report from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This report looked into the farm incomes between 2000 and 2016-17 in collaboration with ICRIER in New Delhi. The report brings out, the study brings out that in those 16 years, Indian farmers lost 45 lakh crore rupees. 45 lakh crore rupees is what the Indian farmers lost, and every year they were losing about 2.6 lakh crore by way of being denied their rightful income. Subsequently, I find that the Niti Aayog itself has come out in a report which says that between 2011-12 and 2015-16, the growth in the real farm income was less than 0.5% every year, 0.44% to be exact. For the next 2 years, the Niti Aayog itself has said that the farm incomes have, the growth in farm income has been near zero, quote unquote. So which means if you look at the last 2 decades, either the farm income has been on a decline or has remained frozen. Now, how do you expect agriculture to do well or farmers to do well when their income remains frozen or is on the decline? I think it's a question which economists refuse to answer. And it's a question which they perhaps are many are very happy. When I look at the articles, they are saying, oh, this is remarkable. You know, these people are getting out of agriculture and an unproductive sector, getting into a productive sector in the city. And we know what happened to that productive sector when the lockdown happened. Just 2 days of lockdown and the lifeline was snatched for them, and they preferred to walk home hundreds of kilometers, thousands of kilometers to reach home. Now, that tells us clearly that that model of development is not what the country needs. And I think that the Prime Minister had spelled out earlier when he said Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. That was the way forward, and Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas is not possible unless you address that inequity that is, or the kind of discrimination that prevails with the rural population, essentially agriculture, because agriculture is the mainstay of the rural economy. Now, if agriculture prospers, the rural economy also prospers. So let's be very clear. When we develop agriculture, we are developing the entire rural economy also. The domino effect would be there. And once the rural economy develops, we will see, of course, the national economy also growing up. Something which is not in our textbooks. You know, you could look at Economics 101, Economics 201. It doesn't talk about it. It only tells us that we have to move people out of agriculture. Unless we move people out of agriculture, we will not be heading towards economic growth. So that's the kind of model that has been pushed on to us globally and then, of course, nationally. Because most the policymakers tend to blindly ape or blindly follow what the West has been telling us. I think that has been the biggest tragedy of Indian development process. Few of them, of course, have stood out and have made their voice clear, but generally the mainline economic thinking is, even now I'm surprised when the world is witnessing all over the world, not only in India, pandemic has shown the kind of inequity that prevails, and we know what is happening to the larger sections of the population. And yet I find every other day economists telling us we need to go for aggressively more growth, which means more of destruction of the natural resources, more of impoverishment of the poor and normal citizen, and only the income flowing to the top 1%. This is what we have seen, and perhaps the benefits being taken by the next 5% or the 10% population. So that is the model which I think now needs rethinking, and that's a model which I think we need to come back to, and that's why I said we are very grateful to Bahá'í Chair for introducing this subject, and perhaps this is a topic which I think we need to deliberate more frequently across the country today, and so that to draw attention to the failed development paradigm this country has adopted all these years, and even now is not willing to learn a lesson. But there are voices now which is erupting, and I think that is one thing which is important. But I think at the academic level, the kind of discourse that I would have expected is not happening. And I think as Professor said, that there are lots of development practitioners in this seminar. I think that is the kind of community we expect to react to stand up and to start beginning to start asking those difficult questions that need to be asked, which may not be politically correct, but of course is what the future is all about. Now, what needs to be done, of course, is agriculture has lots of problems. I don't deny it. Agriculture also, let's not forget, is one which has been kept starved of public sector investment, because, as I said earlier, the best way to move people out of agriculture is not to physically push them out, but to create uneconomical condition, which means also to reduce investments. Now, I'm looking at a RBI report, a Reserve Bank of India report, which tells us that between 2011-12 and 2017-18, the public sector investment in agriculture was 0.4% of the GDP. Now, for a sector which has 50% of the country's population, you are only making an investment of 0.4% of the GDP. Please tell me, what miracle do you expect? What miracle do you expect? And every year we give 6% of the GDP just as tax concession to the corporates. And I think nobody raises those alarms or those the kind of inequalities that are being deliberately perpetuated over the decades by the economic design that we follow. You know, look at also this the vocabulary that has been created. If you give money to this to the poor, or for food security, or for ensuring helping the farmers by way of MSP and so on, it is said, oh, you are giving them subsidy. Subsidy is a demonized word. You know, and it is said, oh, this money is going down the drain. It is not something that the country can afford, and so on. And of course, the fiscal deficit will go up. When the Seventh Pay Commission came, it addresses income problem only for about 4% of the population. But imagine the Credit Suisse telling us that the total expenditure every year, in additional expenditure every year, would be 4,80,000 crores. Did you hear of fiscal deficit? Did you hear somebody telling you that, that this money is a subsidy? But we were made to believe that, you know, only that money that goes to the poor is a subsidy. Look at the corporates. The kind of subsidies we give to corporates, you know, we call them incentive for growth. For a number of years on the different panels, when I will say that these incentive for growth are also subsidies, I would be blamed for not understanding economics, and I would be called as anti-development. But when the Prime Minister himself and the ET summit said that the incentive for growth actually are subsidies, I'm very grateful to him. At least I have not been called as anti-development now. The point I'm trying to make is that discourse has been also, you know, brought up in such a language and in such a manner that, you know, we generally tend to believe that the poor people, those who live in the rural areas, are actually a burden on the society. Now, that unfortunate that the build-up that, or the kind of narrative that has built up, is something which perhaps needs to be dispelled now after the reverse migration that the nation has seen, something which was phenomenal, and which, as I said earlier, tells us the extent of agriculture refugees, or the number of agriculture refugees that exist in this country. Now, can we make agriculture profitable and economically viable and at the same time sustainable? The answer is yes. We need to bring more investments in agriculture. We need to provide more money into the hands of farmers, because today, as I said earlier, if I add on to that, the Economic Survey 2016 had told us very clearly that the average income of a farming family in 17 states of India, which means half the country practically, is rupees 20,000 a year. Imagine 70 years after independence, if the income of farming family is 20,000 rupees a year in half the country, shouldn't we be hanging our head in shame? Is that the kind of development model this country needs? The point I'm trying to make is we refuse to provide them, we denied them their rightful income, and that is why the level stands there. And if you think that the technological inputs and so on have brought in a kind of a great change in Punjab, let's look into that situation also, because normally it is said that unless you increase productivity, first increase irrigation, second increase productivity, and then of course incomes increase. It didn't happen in America. It hasn't happened in Punjab. Punjab is the most progressive state. Punjab has 98% assured irrigation, which means every field gets a regular supply of water throughout the year. It has the highest productivity of cereal crops in the world, wheat, rice, and maize, and yet it has turned into a hotbed of farmer suicides. 16,600 suicides between 2000 and 2015 in Punjab, the most progressive of the agricultural states, which means the problem didn't lie in the crop field, the problem was outside the crop field, and which we refused to see, which was basically denying farmers their rightful income. And that is why the indebtedness increases over the years, and agriculture sector thrives, or as Charan Singh used to say, that farmer takes birth in debt and dies in debt. That's the model that has existed in India. That's the model that existed in Europe. That's the model that has existed in America. In America, the markets are thriving at the huge agricultural subsidies the state pumps in year after year, and we generally believe this is what efficiency is all about, or this is what markets efficiency is all about. If markets were so efficient in America, there was no reason why the US Department of Agriculture chief economist would go on record saying that the real income of farmers in America has been on a steep decline since the 1960s. What has propped them up is the huge agricultural subsidy that goes into agriculture. This is happening in America, the same model we are trying to bring in India. As I said earlier, our economists are great people. They only try to, mainland economists only try to borrow the failed technology, failed models from the developed countries. And why can't we have innovative thinking? Why can't we have original thinking? Why can't we redesign a development model where rural economy becomes the pivot of development? Can't it be done? What Mahatma Gandhi said was not something which was past or was part of the history. It is something which is the future of the history. And I think that is where we need to come down. It is time we bring up our focus to see that rural economy becomes, as I said earlier, the pivot of development. Because once people will have more money in the hands, when farmer will have more money in the hands, the demand they will generate demand, and that is what the economic growth all depends upon. So creating that demand, I think, depends upon providing more capacity into the hands of agriculture, more money into the hands of farmers. Even if the land holdings are small, it is much better to build up that kind of a livelihood than to push him into the cities to become a Bahá'í Mazdoor. I think that is something we need to understand, and that is where I think we need to draw attention to, that this is the future that the country is eagerly looking forward to. Will it happen or will it not happen, and what approaches we need to follow? I think that is something we can dwell on, we can work on, but I think that, as you rightly mentioned in your concept note, that acknowledgement of the bias that has taken place is the first step. If we acknowledge that was a bias, that was a wrong thinking that we had followed all these years, then only we can take the next steps to correct that process. And I think here, I would thank the Bahá'í Chair for bringing up a subject which is very, very crucial for the future of this country. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma, for bringing up so many issues. I would like to, maybe we can take a few questions before we move on. Professor Srivastava, there is a question addressed to you, which from one of the participants, who says, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. What are some examples of policies in India in recent years that you feel are having or could have a positive influence on rural development, along the lines of the parameters you identify? In other words, we are not ahistorical. I mean, we are talking in the here and now. The context is the environment. I mean, the world we live in. So, are there progressive policies that you think have have contributed and are something that we can be hopeful about? You are muted.
Do you want me to answer this straight away?
Yes, if you could.
So one can make a distinction between central level policies and state level policies. At the state level, I would like to draw the attention of the participants to what Kerala has achieved in the last about 15 years through the strengthening of the local Panchayati Raj structure, the way it galvanized intellectual resources to build the structure. Secondly, then what it did was towards from using the Kutumbashri structure. The Kutumbashri are basically it's again a structure within the Panchayati Raj structure, which moves from neighborhood groups of the rural poor to then the area groups, which are built up at a slightly higher level, and they have a mandatory voice in local level planning. So the rural poor women have a mandatory voice in local level planning, but they also organize in self-help groups. And then these self-help groups they take the process of participatory development forward so that the rural poor have a voice. Secondly, they directly participate in the process of participatory development through, for example, leasing of land, carrying out group activities, group economic activities, and so on. So under the former chief minister, for example, unused fallow paddy land was leased out to groups of these women, and they were able to increase paddy cultivation and paddy production in the state of Kerala through their own efforts. And also the way now, if you look at the Panchayati Raj structure in Kerala, it's an amazing, the way they have harnessed information technology and software technology into the governance principles of the Panchayat. Some of these things are really remarkable. I don't know how many of us have looked very closely at what Kerala is doing, but it is remarkable by global standards. Yes, a lot more can be done to bring this vision of what Ela Bhatt calls the 100-mile economy into effect, because this also means using, as I said, local information hubs to strengthen local producer networks. I think you rightly raised the point is that information is all right, but participation probably means an information plus model of some kind, which we need to look at. The plus is available in Kerala, but the information part at the local level, in local hubs, bringing together retailers, bringing together farmers, and so on, is something which is needed to counteract the effect of to provide a counterweight to way the Amazons and the contract farming structures and the agribusiness is making inroads in the rural areas. So this is one example I can certainly give, and I think it's really the most remarkable example that exists today within India. There are smaller examples, but these examples are led more by non-state actors, so not at the policy level. And of that, you have a number of examples throughout the country, because in India, we have a very vibrant non-state sector. So those examples come from there.
There is a question, perhaps it could be to both Professor Srivastava and Dr. Sharma. Dr. Sharma raised this point of that we need a new ways of thinking about development, and part of the issue that always somehow these discussions on development get entangled with is the question of growth. That if the people are to receive higher incomes, the economy needs to grow. And if the economy needs to grow, we need to focus on high growth or sectors that have high growth potential. And in a sense, you know, rising tides lift all boats. That if the aggregate, the economy as a whole grows, eventually it will take everyone to a higher level of you know, income and prosperity. And there are some statistics offered of how many millions have gone above the poverty line since these policies have been implemented. So clearly there are problems with, like I think both Professor Srivastava and Dr. Sharma mentioned that this neoliberal worldview has its challenges, and somehow thinking within it doesn't allow for one to break out of these exploitative patterns of development. But then the question, and I think Professor Srivastava's last comment kind of indicated this, is where does the alternative come from? Most of the experiments are somehow happening at the level of civil society or non-state actors. Dr. Sharma referred to the need to invest more in agriculture, but then the question is, how does one make sure that translates into just development? It actually empowers, or you know, the weakest within rural settings, and it doesn't become the case that you know, the wealthy farmer or those, again, the same pattern of concentration of wealth is replicated in rural areas. So in a sense, what is the way really that one can see in terms of influencing policy with regard to rural development and strengthening rural economies in a way that is just and participatory? And I understand it may not be a one formula, it may not be a one-step thing, but in a sense, what is the path? What are the steps forward?
So I think Dr. Sharma can come in first. I'll say a little more then later on.
Okay. You know, globally, I'm seeing a very positive change that is happening place. A few of the economists are now beginning to say that we need to move towards a degrowth, and we also need to move a Green Deal. And some people talk about green economy and so on. I think that's something which is coming up as a topic of discussion, and I think many countries have also begun to follow. I'm very happy that the New Zealand government, the new Prime Minister has said she is not interested in GDP, and she is going to talk about economic well-being. The Iceland head of the state also done that, and many states are now beginning to take on that. And I'm so glad. I don't know, for whatever political reason, China has said that it's not going to work out GDP. I'll be so happy if they don't. And I think that they have created more problems by building up this argument that GDP is the touchstone to development. I think that that's a model which has failed. You know, if in a country like India, top 1%, so wealth is equal to 4 times the wealth of the bottom 73%. I think it's time to draw a lesson that GDP only has helped buttress that wealth support for the top 1%. It is therefore time to ensure that that is evenly distributed and the benefits pass on to the poor in the rural areas also. And I believe, as you said in your concept note, that the talent and the enterprising ability of the rural population needs to be exploited, and that needs kind of a support that will, in my understanding, build up a kind of a new alternative that the world is looking forward to. Now that is where the support needs to come. I just give you one illustration. You know, it will tell you how these inequalities are woven in. You know, when you invite the IT sector to come and set up their office in, let's say, Mohali in near Chandigarh, you are actually giving them land at 50 acres of land at 1 rupee per square meter. You know, when you invite Apollo to set up that Apollo hospital in New Delhi, we gave them 15 acres of land at 1 rupee per acre. Imagine if the poor people in the villages were to get that land 10 by 10 meters at 1 rupee per square meter. Imagine the kind of change development process that it will initiate. So we are not wanting to do that. That's the problem I'm trying to say. We are not wanting to look into that kind of possibility. We think, no, the poor, you know, given the framework that already exists, we want to make changes. That's not going to make any difference that we talk about. We need fundamental changes. Maybe we need to overhaul the structure, and let's not be ashamed of it. We can do that. We can try. We are not a country like America or Europe that we have to blindly follow their policies. I think it will be much better for India if the larger sections of the society live in the rural areas. I just want to end up with one more point, that you know the policymakers are telling us that by the year 2050, 70% of the population would be living in the urban areas. Now, I saw many economists rejoicing over it. That's the pathway to economic growth. I said that's a suicidal pathway to growth, if that's what you mean. Let's be very clear. A United Nations study tells us that in 2050, when 70% population will live in urban areas of India, you know, and if we take that proportion to the total area of the country, only 2% of the geographical area will be covered by the urban areas. Is that what you mean by development? Do you want to put people in a ghetto and then you think you have a progressive lot just because the corporates want it to be easy for them? You know, why can't we have, when the World Bank wants to say ease of doing business, everyone rejoices in this country. We are fastly working towards that. The minister goes on record saying we have taken 7,000 steps of ease of doing business, small and big. Why can't we have ease of doing farming? Just because the World Bank didn't tell us? Why do we have to take economic prescription from the World Bank and IMF? Why can't we have that courage to stand up and say, sorry, we have had enough of this tamasha. Now let's look into something which is good for this country and we can draw our own policies. It is not saying that you are excluded from the globe. You are saying you are trying to show a pathway to globe, that this is the way forward and this is what we need to integrate into. If New Zealand can show the way, if Iceland can show the way, India can perhaps do it in a much bigger way, and the world would be looking up to it.
Okay, just to add from where Dr. Sharma started, actually, you know, every crisis produces responses, and it also forces governance structure in states to respond in unconventional ways. We saw it in the 2008-9 crisis, and we are also seeing it today. However, I must say that although the responses, you know, the short-term responses in response to the pandemic have been unconventional, I'm a little disappointed that it has not led to more deeply structured rethinking about the cause which has taken place. In the after post 2008, you would remember there was a Stiglitz Commission set up by the UN, which came up with very radical suggestions. You would remember that the UN system again mooted the concept of a social protection floor, which was again a very important suggestion, recommendation, and it then resulted in the ILO recommendation 202 and so on. And we have not still seen structured responses of that kind after this crisis as yet. But having said that, whenever changes happen in response to crisis or otherwise, the most deep-rooted changes happen when the state and civil society act in tandem. When there is pressure from below and states respond through cogent policy, coherent policy, structured measures. This is what we have seen at the provincial level in India. Stable policies in Tamil Nadu or in Kerala or in Andhra Pradesh have happened as a result of a consensus which is built up through ground level pressure. So, you know, when we critique policies, when we talk about alternative paradigms, there is a lot of importance which we must attach to how we think about restructuring from the ground level upwards. And that is the role, even if the states are non-responsive for a brief period of time. It doesn't matter. That's one thing I would say. Secondly, on the growth question, the composition of growth is as important as the magnitude of growth. I give an example to my students sometime in a seminar that when I was in school, still in school, I read an article in the Economic Political Weekly by Professor C.T. Kurian, which actually was on GDP measurement of national income, and which compared the production of a cake to production of rotis, chapatis. Now, you can produce many chapatis to quell the hunger of poor people, but the value addition in terms of GDP terms may be more if you produce a cake. Okay, so this is how GDP is a financialization. It reflects the financialization of an economy in a particular way. But when we talk about well-being, it is a composition of the growth which is equally important. So we don't have to say that no growth. Yes, growth is important, but the composition of the growth is very important when we talk about growth. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can now move on to our next panelist, Dr. Janak Palta McGilligan. Dr. McGilligan is the founder director of Jimmy McGilligan Center for Sustainable Development and the former founder director of Burley Development Institute for Rural Women in Indore. She was awarded with the Padma Shri Award by the Government of India in 2015 in recognition of her nearly 4 decades of work in the field of development, especially among tribal women in the state of Madhya Pradesh, and more recently in the field of community development. From looking at these ideas of alternative possibilities for rural development, I'm sure we're going to have a very enlightening address from Dr. Janak, or Janak Didi as we call her, which is based on nearly 40 years now of hands-on development work, and she will share her insights from this experience.
We are not hearing her.
You are mute, Janak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arash Fazli, for having me on this very, very special, I think it's a very pioneering effort to talk about rural economy of India with justice and prosperity. I would like to, since you have asked me to talk about empowerment of women for sustainable rural economies in India, I'm just going to share that my learning, because we had experts, Dr. Devinder Sharma, Dr. Ravi Srivastava ji, and we are going to have Varsal Norani. I'm not an academician and I'm not a really scientist, but whatever I have learned from my experience, and because it's all about women and rural India. So to me, the first reaction on this subject is that since the independence, the country has been ruled by industrial elites, political power centers who come from so-called higher caste and higher class, and all people who are very, very, very big resources. Rural economy has been, patterns of governance have been to benefit the industry and business and more urban areas. And when we talk about patterns of governance and policy, have been all mainly governed by those industry domination and business domination. And but as much as urban area has been given preference and dominance, and similarly, I feel all economy in India has been mostly male dominated, where it's based on patriarchy, and women have been really, really neglected and discriminated. They are the 80% of the rural women are the workforce in the country, but they have not been really. I'm very happy because we have Dr. Vidyavindar Sharma who has brought all the data. I wish next time we have him for talking about man-women data also. And they have a greater share of work, but they bear the disproportionate burden of work. They sleep 2 hours less than men. They have they sacrifice their quality life. They don't have any quality life. They have to only give and do. And there is no such a concept as leisure. When I used to go and live in tribal areas, I saw every morning in winter time, there is a fire and all the men are heating themselves, warming themselves up, and the women are all busy in the sweeping, and they would do the stone grinding, because they get up at 3 o'clock. They have to look after the goats and buffaloes and cows and children and husband. And then at the night they come and they are drunk and they just bear a lot of violence and domestic violence. They get a lot of violence, social violence. And unfortunately in India, when we talk about the most neglected and discriminated people, are majority of them are scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. And then out of that, majority is women who have suffered. So this has been the scenario, and illiteracy has been a big issue. Health has been a big issue. If we talk about rural economy, it will depend on the status of women. Their level of literacy, their social health, their empowerment, but what has happened so far, not only rural economy, but in general, Indian government and the announcements in all the elections and whatever happens later on is about infrastructure and facilities, not the participation of local people, no involvement. They are not part of planning, organizing, implementing, evaluating, monitoring. They become more vulnerable to exploitation, and there has been more disparity, and the gaps have been increasing from, if we look at the times of 1947 till now. Because of time limit, I can't give the details, but we see the gap between wealth and poverty has increased. And this is the status, and the women have been the worst hit in the whole status. And in India, there has been some efforts, only very, very minor. I'm sure Dr. Srivastava and Devinder Sharma know about Integrated Rural Development Program they announced, IRDP, right, Devinder? They talked about that integrated development program will be relevant to environment, ecology, appropriate technology, land development for types of crops, water management, soil enrichment and irrigation, institutional infrastructure, interconnected with knowledge, resources and their application, and self-reliance, local initiative and participation. But this was just a statement. This just remained on a paper. We all know there is no sustained effort to do rural economy and do justice and prosperity. Since I have been a very active participant in the women movement from 1972 till now, and the biggest document was produced when we were there at the Fourth World Women's Conference in 1995, when the UN brought the document. And this was our first document of, I'm glad Farida Wahidi is here. She has been a lot involved in this whole movement. Women empowerment had 5 components. First means women empowerment means what? According to UN document of 1995, women's sense of self-worth, their right to have and to determine their choices, their right to have access to opportunities and resources, a right to have the power to control their own lives, both within and outside home or place of work or wherever they are, and their ability to influence the direction of social change to create a more just social and economic order, nationally and internationally. This was a document. This was I still think it has been like a vision for times, but India has no studies, because you are all Bahá'í Chair and Devinder Sharma and Srivastava ji, and I'm sure Vasal is also involved in studies and research. There is no studies reflect UN benchmarks in gender studies. And women are, they're continued to confront with discrimination, deprivation of rights, deprivation of opportunities, and they continue to lose out to men in terms of making their own decisions, access to societies, and all the resources. So economically, women have been producers, and they have been provider of subsistence to family, food stuff, and they are the social change makers, whether it is recognized or not. They are the first teachers of the family, and they are center to maintain family stability and run the family and balance everybody. According to, after that, Agenda 21. I was very fortunate to be at Earth Summit when Agenda 21 came, and the sustainable development, according to Agenda 21, was that women have to be, their participation has to be key to ensure reproductive health, planning of family, pre and postnatal care, education and work opportunities strongly affect sustainable and healthy ecosystems. Agenda 21 also, these are the only documents which have talked about good health depends on social, economic and spiritual status of women, spiritual development of women. So it is very coincidental that I came to start Bahá'í Development Institute for Rural Women in 1985, when it did not exist, but it continued as a project of Baha'i Vocational Institute for Rural Women, and we had no infrastructure or facilities at that time. But by 2001, I was asked to form an NGO and given autonomy to form this institute, Autonomous Institute, and they asked me to name it. So I named it Bahá'í Development Institute for Rural Women. I want specially here to mention Bahá'í, literal meaning of Bahá'í word is the central pillar of a tribal home. It is the Bhilala dialect. So the home, the family, and the whole society and the world, if you pull out the central pillar, everything falls down. So to me, Burli means woman. So I named the institute Burli Development Institute for Rural Women. And the coincidence is that 2001 was the year of empowerment of women. And 2001, Burli Institute came as a new independent NGO to start its work. And the objective of the institute was to develop women, rural and tribal women, as human resources to become positive social change agents, to be able to become able to sustain themselves, their families, and their communities. So hence contribute to the economy of India, society of India, socio-economic development of India. So the idea was that they have they learn to be self-reliant, they learn to understand the purpose of their life and how they become conscious of their role in society as equal wings of humanity. This is because Baha'i inspired institute project, and I am also a follower of Baha'i faith. So I purposely want people to know that humanity is a bird. It has two wings of humanity. And that means they're equal. They're not same, but they're equal and complementary, and they have to fly with the mutual strength. But once you have tied down one wing, it could not fly. So we tried to work at that institute to train women. We developed training programs. We developed systematic curriculums with gender focus. And this gender focus was wings. This gender focus is not V2, UTWO, V2, man and woman. We together develop this family and life, and the importance of how they will become, they are empowered with more knowledge about themselves. We developed curriculum of health, literacy, vocational skills, environment, and one subject which I think has helped us and those women a lot is to learn to develop myself and my community. So they become active actors and ambassadors of rural development. And this happened that they bring change from themselves, and they change the people in their family by practicing their knowledge, new knowledge they have acquired, their change in their attitude, and practicing. So as a result, we started this approach of women to, because till now we saw all the boys, male members who went to study in the urban areas, they never came back. They wanted to always, the migration issue is the result of not boys not living in the villages, and they all migrated, they came out. And from that we learned that we train these women with the focus, with the commitment that they will go back to their communities and help their communities and take out all their knowledge and take individual initiative as well as work as small groups in their communities. And we trained 6,000 girls from 500 villages who learned about improving their economy with vocational skills and literacy and health and empowerment and communication skills. But what we heard all our time till now, many girls are phoning me and telling me that one girl is earning 5,000 rupees a month. She is also working on her farm. When she has time, it is raining, she works on her sewing machine. But what their parents have told us always is that they have gained more confidence. Even after 6 months of residential program, we could see a lot of self-confidence. They became more conscious to be bringing unity, love, and they in each village they went back and they helped their communities to make as Mahila Mandals. So 500 villages, these girls returned with empowered women, and they helped the economy. They have been earning 41% of the women, those girls, earning livelihood with the vocational skills, 46% with selling vegetables and farm products. They have their grocery shops, they have their shops of phones, and and they're Anganwadi workers, they're Asha workers in their village. Some of them are nurses, some of them have become teachers, but all of them are living in their villages. They have just moved from their parental house to their in-laws' house. But those girls have brought remarkable changes. First of all, they were able to eradicate guinea worms from 302 villages in Jhabua district, which was the first time in the country that happened. And then they have been planting trees. We also worked with a lot of new technologies with them, using natural resources, working on organic farming and food processing, use of solar dryers, solar cookers. And when these women took cookers home, we thought this will relieve them from smoke and health and save environment. But we were shocked when they said their dignity is saved, because they were vulnerable when they had to walk miles and miles from sexual abuse. They told us that they had miscarriage of their children during advanced stage of pregnancy. They had to carry heavy load of wood. They don't have to inhale the smoke. There is no domestic pollution. And they also started using those solar cookers for earning money, cooking some nice snacks and selling in their weekly market. Then there are women who started solar tea stall. Some of them have groups of women in Baitul district. They made a huge economic use of solar cookers for livelihood, and they came out of their regular job of working as laborers. Today, something that I want to say, when we have started, Dr. Fazli has started the note of this webinar with migrants. I am very proud and I'm thankful to God for the opportunity to work with these 6,000 girls. None of them had to migrate. They came to the institute as coming from migrant laborers. Their families were migrant laborers. None of the girls we have trained had to become a migrant labor, because they have their livelihood, and they also work for improving the health, improving the infant mortality, child mortality, and there were the huge reduction in waterborne disease. So I'm only
Janak Didi, if you could just conclude in 1 minute.
I'm finishing. I'm just giving the after the retirement, I also still continue to work. I have trained 86,000 youths from rural areas to become ready for sustainable community development. The subject is sustainable community. My own village where I'm living, now this village had farmers selling their own vegetable, own farmer market, organic food, organic milk, organic cooking oil, their ghani, they have their own cold press machine. So they're going for organic, and we have also created a space for farmers or Javik Setu. So what I recommend at the end very quickly is that the policy makers have to be very serious about this subject, that their policies are aligned with their implementation plans and implementation. It has to be holistic approach, not just economy. GDP is not a proof of sustainable development. Everybody knows. And Sustainable Development Goal 5 is for gender equality. It has to be seriously given priority. And there is and we learned that there has to be a bottom-up approach. We are talking about grassroots, and there has to be a rectitude of conduct and pure motive. When the NGO form their NGO, sometimes they think they'll get a lot of funds, and they are not watching and auditing their financial affairs. So the economy with social outcome and economy with ecological development will lead to sustainable development, and it has to be empowering more and more women. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Janak Didi, for this very valuable and insightful contribution, which brought our attention to this gender dimension of building strong and vibrant local economies. And this has especially come to the fore with the lockdown that came into place with the pandemic, where the work of women increased manifold, because in addition to what they were doing, now they had to take care of the family, which till earlier was outside working. Now so in a sense, the non-remunerative aspects of the work that women perform, like you said, they sleep less, they're almost constantly engaged in either domestic or economic labor. That aspect has not been acknowledged, and somehow part of thinking of just economic arrangements at the local level would have to address these injustices. Friends, because of the lack of time, I will introduce our next speaker. Dr. Vaisal Noorani holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University in the USA and is a postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research asks, what is the changing role of communities in local economic systems, which is very relevant to our discussion today. The empirical focus of his research to date has been sub-Saharan village economies, where he tries to develop an increasingly nuanced and sound understanding of the role of social relationships, social norms, and local knowledge systems in the economic lives of predominantly farming households. So we look forward to Dr. Noorani's presentation, which will also bring the perspective from another continent, Africa. Yes, Vaisal, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Fazli, and thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to the Bahá'í Chair for inviting me and for allowing me to speak after I've had the chance to hear all the wonderful insights from the other panelists. I feel I can maybe try to enrich my presentation a little bit with those insights. I just want to mention that I'm going to focus on this question of knowledge systems and in local economy, which I think has been brought up by other panelists today. And the experiences, I'm going to have a two-part presentation. One is just to think about the role of knowledge systems in general in this process of structural and agricultural transformation and how it's led to the patterns that we are seeing today. And that's going to be very brief. And then also very brief is going to be some very nascent, necessarily nascent experiences that I've been observing and researching and analyzing in Uganda, where I'm working with a wonderful non-governmental organization called Kimanya Ngeo Foundation for Knowledge and Science, Education and Science. And I say necessarily nascent because of the need for creative, original solutions in the context of the current world order. And so I think hopefully the experiences can inspire and provide some new creative thinking for pathways forward in different parts of the world. So I just also wanted to highlight again the questions that the Baha'i Chair has posed. One question is, did the path to development for rural peoples necessitate the migration of such large numbers to cities? The second question was, once the intensity of the present crisis subsides, is the only option before policymakers to re-implement the same policies that created the conditions that caused such massive rural to urban migration? And so for me, these questions kind of lead me to ask another one, which is, how did these agricultural structural transformation policies emerge in the first place? And of course, this is such a loaded question, and there are so many ways of thinking about responding to it. But I want to focus our attention on this dimension of knowledge systems and really the logic that underpin the policies that the world has been experiencing over the last 100 to 200 years. So there's this wonderful book by a professor at MIT in the History of Science department called Every Farm a Factory. And I'm going to read one passage because I feel it's very lucid and relevant to the conversation. And she focuses on American agriculture. And she says that prior to the 1920s, there was so much variability in American agriculture, so many different crops, types of farmers, types of land and climate, that agricultural experts were anxious to find not only a language, but also a practice that could make farming more manageable. What followed was that agricultural experts began to focus not on the idiosyncrasies and differences among farmers, but on the similarities, trying to find common problems. And it was this rationalizing activity and the agricultural experts' belief in it as an analytical tool that made American agriculture transferable to other countries in what came to be known as the Green Revolution. So this is a very interesting lens through which to think about this pattern that has unfolded in the last 100 years or so, because it shows, it kind of describes something that many rural parts of the world have experienced, which is actually a homogenization of production systems through a very specific logic that actually the technologies, the sciences that we develop, they are developed by experts, by those who have a particular motive for making farming more manageable, increasing capital inflow into the agricultural sector of the economy, and so on. So similar to the 1920s, when this logic emerged, we are also undergoing this process where our sense of normality is being shattered. And this allows us to ask new questions and to think about new paradigms and new frames for operating, and especially a new logic. And I think this idea of a new underlying logic is crucial to thinking about the role of knowledge systems and knowledge in general in economic production. And I think it's a very wonderful frame that the Baha'i Chair has provided for us to think about just and prosperous rural economies as some underlying principles for the logic that we seek to establish. So then what does this mean? So I think one of many of the dimensions of this logic really involves thinking about participation in knowledge systems, and especially participation by populations that have been historically marginalized, which includes the entirety of the rural population of the world, as well as many, many women and those who do not hold the power in many parts of the world. So what can we think about when thinking about this dimension of knowledge systems? Well, one, we have to think that science and technology are twin forces in the path of development. And one useful way of thinking about this too is that science helps us understand the ways in which the world works, both the physical and social dimensions of reality. But then technology takes those understandings and applies them in specific ways to alter the way that the world works for a particular objective, for a particular outcome. And that what the Professor Fitzgerald was sharing in the previous slide was that those objectives, those outcomes that drove technological advancement were not shared by everyone, but they were articulated by a set of experts that had a particular set of objectives. So then the next question would be, whose values and priorities drive the development of science and technology? And really, how do we include rural populations in articulating the values and priorities? And really related to that is this third question of what riches and gems might we find if rural populations are equipped with the capabilities that enable processes of discovery. And I think this is a little bit around the conversation that we were having earlier around information or information plus something. And I think this something is really this capacity to engage in the generation of knowledge and contribute to the evolving conversations around the world around development processes. So I'm going to describe, try to describe two very practical ways of thinking about this. Again, I want to emphasize that they're nascent, they're ongoing research experiences in Uganda. The first is in the second year of a 5-year-long project where we're thinking about the reconceptualization of rural pedagogy and education and the implications for that reconceptualization on local economic development. And the second is really just a development that has emerged as a result of the pandemic, as many university students and other secondary age students in Uganda have returned to their villages and want to do something productive and useful. And we started to explore this idea of a village research seminar, and now even a network of villages that are thinking about research together. And again, these are not mature experiences, or at least the research around them is not mature yet, but nevertheless, perhaps they will offer some insights for small steps that can be taken both by practitioners as well as academicians. And I might not have the time to get into it, but I've also been including the governance structures at the district level and the national level in some of the conversations around the evolution of this research, so that it slowly also becomes something that where the institutions of society, the individuals in society, the communities in society, all are participating in the same conversation so that we can reach some level of coherence. So the first experience, we're titling the project Learning to Learn, Learning to Teach by Learning to Learn. And I have a set of co-authors and myself, we're studying this novel teacher training program run by the organization that I'm partnering with here. And in this teacher training, teachers are experiencing firsthand what it means to think and act like scientists and analyzing the world around them. So you can think about what this means, and articulating models, observing reality, analyzing whether the observations you make are consistent with your models, and then thinking about how these models might suggest pathways forward, because we can transcend the limitations of a particular model, be it in the field of agricultural production, the limitations of monocropping, for example, or like the means by which a polycultural system can emerge in a village, and so on. And really the idea here is if economic growth was a product of technological progress, and technological progress is a product of our ability to harness science for a particular objective, why not include a population that has not been involved in this process to develop those technologies and then to generate a type of growth that is relevant to their experience. In this particular case, the theory here is that there's a new conception of knowledge that is emerging in the teachers as they're experiencing this very profound training. And the love of learning that they acquire and the way of learning that they develop, they also want to instill in their students. And we have incredibly promising results so far on some traditional measures that economists and others would be interested in, like student test scores. But we really want to go much further and think about how can we have a conversation that changes the way we think about education, because this is something that could become where we could contribute to systemic change in the education system if things go well. So just to give you an example, in the Ugandan curriculum, there are some, like the National Curriculum Development Center encourages schools and teachers to hold science shows or science fairs, but those science fairs are very rare. And partly because the pedagogy, the logic of education isn't really embedded in this idea of how do we make knowledge useful to local populations. But together with the district education office here, we kind of thought about, well, how do we begin to learn whether schools are making knowledge useful to local populations? And the district education office suggested that we hold these science fairs. And so one way in which we're measuring the change as a result of this program is by seeing what is the quality of scientific experimentation that is emerging in these rural areas through the schools? And then how do those scientific experiments even end up benefiting the parents of the children in these schools, the community members in the schools, and so on? And you can imagine, again, very nascent, but the idea is that over time, a culture can emerge where over successive periods of time, maybe a few months at a time, that really leads to sound understanding and clear understanding of ways in which productivity can be improved, and in a sustainable manner, environmentally friendly manner, and so on. So we're measuring a whole host of outcomes, and hopefully you've had the chance to read some of them. I won't go into them here, but I'll just also mention this second initiative that is again very nascent, but it kind of builds on this idea a little bit. And so Uganda was very proactive in shutting down economic and educational institutions and societal institutions before the first case of COVID-19 was registered in March. The situation is changing a little bit now, but what that allowed us to do was to actually work with our local government. It's called the local council, and recruit a number of young people who have returned from university, they're back in their village, and really begin a conversation with them about the role of research. And how research and how this scientific method can be integrated into the culture of village governance, of community life, and so on. So there's now a handful of students that I work with directly, and now there's a number of villages that we're working with, where we're really using some of the materials that Kimanya Ngeo has been working with to again develop a sound understanding of what science is, what knowledge systems are, how they contribute to development processes, and then begin to articulate questions from within the populations, questions that emerge as a result of the needs that begin to get identified, and then also identify methods and develop research design that allows us to answer the questions that arise around those needs. I'll just give you this kind of picture of one of the efforts made by one of the villages where they mapped out all of the homes in the village. You can see the white dots are the locations of the homes, but then also they divided the village up into groups of families. And so here you can see 15 groups of families. And again, what this allows them to do is to analyze at a deeper level and really begin to observe and summarize at a level that also allows them to ask some questions about processes that they might wish to change. And so one of the processes, again, in the last 4 months that one group has identified is this process of public health, and in particular, reduction of malaria incidents, and also ways of articulating the difference between malaria symptoms and COVID-19 symptoms, because that's also something that has become somewhat of an issue. And you can begin to imagine how the grouping of the families will allow them to introduce different kinds of interventions within the village, and then to monitor how do symptoms change, how does awareness change, how does knowledge change, and again, over time, to develop a sound understanding of the processes that they can introduce into the village to implement change. Another village has begun to track mono and polyculture farming households to understand the impact of crop diversification on various outcomes. And also they have an explicit objective of increasing polycultural production. And so that's also a very fascinating project, and who knows where it can go. And we're just at the beginning stages. So hopefully these experiences just help to inform us on some creative thinking and new paths for just and prosperous rural development. I think really this idea of justice, it doesn't only apply to the material dimension and redistribution of resources, but again, my personal view is that it fundamentally involves the participation in these knowledge systems, because these knowledge systems have been the source of the accumulation of wealth in different pockets over time. So maybe that's enough for now, and we can take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vesal. This was a very enlightening, and I mean, it illustrated in a sense some of these concepts through this actual case of applying participatory pedagogy in Uganda. One question that immediately comes up is for these students in rural areas. You mentioned, you talked about how the questions come from within. In other words, you actually drew a connection between growth and technological progress, and then you said technological progress is based on science, the application of science. But then science, when it is applied or it is used to develop technology, has certain values that guide it. And often those values are not the values of the people who end up using the technology. And so therefore, technological, introducing technological developments in a society transforms that society based on values which are not in sync with that society. And so this was an experiment that you described, where people in the grassroots develop knowledge based on this pedagogy, which was very interesting. But what is the methodology? How do these people do it? It would be helpful to also hear. In other words, how does one go to people at the grassroots in rural areas and empower them to become developers of scientific knowledge without requiring them to finish a master's degree? Because that's the conventional thinking, and by the time they get a master's, they don't want to go back to the rural area anymore. So I think it really goes to the crux. So it would be helpful to hear a little bit from.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and you know, I've benefited in large part by the pandemic. I mean, yeah, I think that's has to be stated, that people are forced to be at home, and there are many questions I've seen that people have asked around what's going to happen after this pandemic. Aren't people going to migrate back? And you know, these are all hypotheticals, and it's hard to know really what the answer is going to be. But also, you know, if we continue on the path of globalization, the way that we've seen it, these kinds of episodes are just going to become more prevalent. And I think as they become more prevalent, we might be forced into more and more local modes of production. And so what I've seen in a lot of the young people that I've had the opportunity to interact with is that they're just attracted to this vision, this idea that, you know, I think there's this intrinsic motive in people that they want to contribute to the well-being of an increasing number of people, and when they can see that they can do that by developing their own capabilities, by developing knowledge from within, it's very motivating. And you can even begin, they can see a pathway forward. And some of the young people that I've worked with, they have degrees, they're in, you know, they're among the most educated people in their village, and they've now like actually made 1 or 2 year commitments to kind of advance this process a little bit in their village. So I think part of it is that, you know, economists will talk about recruitment and selection, and one of the and in-person training. And so there's, at the system level, you want to change, you know, you want to help the education system rethink the way it teaches, and that, I think this teacher training that Kimanya is offering is just a nascent effort, and we'll begin to talk about it more and more with the policymakers at the system level. But then too, if there are these kinds of organizations that are they're implementing a very novel curriculum that was developed in Colombia in the 1970s by an organization called Fundaec, which I think many people are familiar with. And I think really like learning from the organizations that are developing these kinds of curriculums and approaches is something that the world could very much benefit from. And I've been lucky enough that Kimanya was generous enough to partner with me and to allow me to look into what they're doing. And even though their efforts are nascent, they're quite inspiring, and you can begin to trace out a path and shift the conversation a little bit. So I think these are all elements of that process. And to go deep into the pedagogy and to go deep into explaining how this process unfolds, I don't think we have time for that. Maybe you can keep an eye out for when we're able to write the first draft of the paper, and I can share it with the Bahá'í Chair, and you can share it with whoever you'd like after that. But that'll go into it in a bit more depth. But it's very, it would be an injustice to simplify it, I think.
We have reached the end of our allotted time. However, there are many questions which are addressed to many of the speakers. Perhaps the speakers may want to take some time and respond to, if you have time, respond in the Q&A box to the specific questions that have been asked from different speakers. One question which I think maybe we can raise with all the speakers is what can be the strategic way forward for civil society, keeping in mind the impact of the pandemic? How can they align their existing initiatives to contribute for an economically self-reliant local economy? In other words, I mean, there is clearly profound, deep-seated change will require macroeconomic changes and change at the level of policies. But at the same time, what we have seen is a lot of the stimulus for change comes from experiences that have been generated, such as the Kudumbashri movement in Kerala, the work that someone like Dr. Janak McGilligan has done, the experience that Vesal shared. So if one recognizes that there is a great deal that civil society or can do in terms of generating learning that can inform policy, what would be some of the ideas that we would suggest to them? In other words, what would be the steps that in the present situation civil society can take in order to contribute towards a movement in that direction? Would it be focusing on like Vesal shared, looking at the dimension of education, building capacity of rural grassroots people to generate knowledge, to draw upon indigenous knowledge systems, but also build their scientific capacity? Would it be the dimension of, again, what everyone shared, governance structures? And if it is structures of governance, then how would one do it, or what kind of interventions would actually allow for people to participate in the process of development in a creative way, in a way that is, like Dr. Sharma was saying earlier, is not just copying a model which exists, but in a sense, to be able to contribute from their own perspectives, their own experience, their own learning. So I guess the question is broad, but I was just wondering if the speakers would like to respond to this question.
Can I come in then? Just
yes.
Okay. So actually, first of all, I think I pointed this out also in my presentation. Janadi is an example of that, and what others have said. So non-state, civil society organizations have played historically a very important role in providing examples of successful initiatives which the state can replicate and amplify. And this we have seen in a number of areas. I mean, and this stretches across, participation, technological innovation, experiments to provide growth and so on. So this actually stretches across a whole range of things. But I think one should not only confine oneself to looking at civil society initiatives as purely providing prototypes. Actually, in my view, civil society initiatives are equally, if not more important, in the role that they play as social mobilizers and as social influencers and parts of social movements. And that in this country, if you look at, for example, in my view, the most seminal movement that we had was around the right to education, the most transformative. We've had movements in the last 30 years around right to education, right to information, right to employment and so on. But clearly the most transformative of these was the right to education. And you could see how, the civil society organizations coalesced throughout the country in order to produce this transformative change that has happened over a period of time, with many limitations even now. Because particularly with respect to the quality we are able to deliver to the poor and so on and so forth. This is very important. the whole issue here is that if we focus only on prototypes, very important sometimes, but if we ignore the macro dimension and the policy dimension, then there are important limitations which can come. And the most important, the largest experiment of this kind is really the microfinance movement. But if you look at the microfinance movement in Bangladesh and its history over the last 50 years, it tells you both the potential for change and the limitations on change which macroeconomic policies and macroeconomic changes put on an important change. Okay. And social policy also, because patriarchy, there's a lot of question, essentially microfinance was centered on women, empowering women. And if you look at the literature now on microfinance, it's split in two halves, on those who argue that microfinance empowered women and those who actually argue that it disempowered women by actually increasing the work burden on them in many ways, and actually not really shifting patriarchy to the extent it was supposed to shift. So what I'm saying is that one should look at it in a broader sense, in terms of just not only developing very important prototypes, but also part and parts.
Well, if I can add here, what you spelled out, Professor Fazli, is I think we need everything that you spelled out to really bring about a change, and which I think Professor Srivastava also endorsed. That is true. But there are, I think, a couple of initiatives of civil society which have brought about or have emerged as a bigger transformation that country has seen, I think, is something that we must learn from. And one of the examples, of course, is Kudamshri, but the other example is the Andhra Pradesh model of natural farming. And we have seen what started as community-managed sustainable agriculture in Andhra Pradesh, which was very successful, I must say, for about 10, 12 years, started from just one village in Khammam district, and then emerged in 30 lakh acres over a time. And then it transformed into zero-budget natural farming, and now it is called as community-managed natural farming, which has already converted 600,000 farmers from chemical to non-chemical agriculture. Now that becomes a kind of a model globally to follow. I think it's the biggest agroecological model that exists, and it also fits in very well with Ila Bhatt's 100-mile advice that she has been giving us, which I think is very appropriate, and I think that's one success story. We have numerous success stories, but I think everything must bring the focus onto local production and local procurement and local distribution. I think that will be the very significant development that this country needs. The other part, of course, is farm income. So I just want to share my experience here. When I first said that what agriculture needs is a direct income support, there were not many takers for that. And I remember many economists laughing at me and scoffing at me that, here is a foolish man who is trying to say that in an era of market economy wants to transfer income to the farmers. But eventually, I think the idea picked up, and the NDA government, as you all know, has introduced PM Kisan scheme, which I think is a tectonic shift in economic thinking. It brings in, the amount is very less at the moment, 500 rupees per month is what the direct income support to farmers is. But I think it's a beginning, and eventually it will become a kind of an instrument to ensure that the farmers, the losses the farmers have suffered is compensated by the state. After all, let's not forget the data that I gave earlier. 45 lakh crore is if the farmers have suffered in 16 years. I think somebody has to pay for it, because after all, the consumer benefited from it. They benefited by 25% because the farmers were paid less. So I think there's somewhere these kinds of narratives are built up into public action, and then of course into political acceptance. That is one thing. And the other part is that in this country, even today, the protests that we are seeing across the country by farmers to ensure that they get a decent income or they get assured income every month is a civil society effort, I would say. And the farmers all over the country are protesting the recent reforms that the government has introduced, again borrowed from America and Europe, without even realizing that it has failed in those countries. And the farmers, I'm glad, are protesting because they have to stand up for their rights, because the country's policymakers are not going to do that. And let us hope that that also forces the government eventually to introduce or make a minimum support price a legal right for the farmers, because they also, like you and me, deserve to get an assured income package every month. So I think there are a lot of initiatives taking place, and some, of course, have translated into public policy, and many others, I'm sure, will follow suit. But it will only happen if the academia also joins hands with the civil society efforts, which is unfortunately not as desired as I would have desired. Thank you.
So friends, we have unfortunately exceeded our time limit, and I realize many of you might have had made other plans. So I think it is timely to conclude now this very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. The proceedings will be put up online, and it will be accessible to a much larger audience, and we will keep you informed about it. This, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the second in a series, and we hope that to participate and contribute to our future webinars as well on this important theme. There are many participants who have asked specific questions from the various speakers. So once we conclude, the session will still be not end the session, so that if speakers wish, they can respond in writing to the particular questions that participants have asked them in the Q&A box. But formally, I would like to once again thank our esteemed speakers for taking time out and really enriching our understanding on this vital theme. And I think we all leave this seminar with a much more nuanced and better understanding of both the challenges faced by rural economies and the possibilities that exist for moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.